Well, last week we kind of left Paul hanging. On one hand, he had been saved from the murderous mob in the temple that was trying to beat him to death. But on the other hand, now he had been arrested by the Romans. Right? And the Romans were cruel. They were getting ready to whip him mercilessly. And Paul told them that he's a Roman citizen, and they stopped the whipping. But his life is still in danger. And we know what happens because we have read the end of the story, right? Paul will never be free again. But his adventure in serving Jesus absolutely continues with all of its obstacles and its opportunities. And as we read on, we see that Paul almost trips over the next obstacle that he faces. Acts chapter 20, the end of 22 and 23 today. And let me set the scene before we start reading. Remember, Paul is now being held by the Romans in the Tower of Antonia, which is connected just outside the temple wall. Right? And the commander who arrested him is confused. He can't figure out why this mob was so angry, what it was that made them so angry that they wanted to kill Paul. He didn't understand. And so here's what he does to finally get his answer. Right? 22 verse 30. It says the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Okay, so it says that he had Paul released, which is a good thing, but he really wasn't released. He was immediately handed over to the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin was the Jewish Supreme Court, and they had the final word on any religious issue or secular issue. They were the final word in Israel besides the Romans. And they met in the temple, in the north wall, in what was called the Chamber of Hewn Stone. It might be worth looking up a picture of the temple and a picture of the Chamber of Hewn Stone. You can see where Paul was and where the Sanhedrin met. The Sanhedrin was made up of 71 men. Sorry, ladies, in that days it was only men. Okay, 71 men with the high priest being in charge. And the high priest at that time was a man named Ananias. So the commander is letting the Jewish justice system figure this out for him. So Paul is hauled in there, and he's standing before the Sanhedrin. And Paul sees this as another opportunity, as an opportunity from God to talk about Jesus, and this time to the most powerful men in Israel. What an opportunity. And so he starts, but he doesn't get very far into his story. Read the first 5 verses of chapter 23 with me. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin, these 71 powerful men, and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, and yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest. For it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" So Paul gets started talking about Jesus, but he doesn't get very far, right? He gets his first sentence out before he gets distracted from talking about Jesus. Right? One sentence in, and the high priest orders Paul to be slapped across the mouth. Now, a slap like this was a huge offense. You just didn't slap somebody. And it was the official punishment for blasphemy, dishonoring God with your words. So when Paul said to the Sanhedrin, I have fulfilled my duty to God, to them, this was a claim by Paul really to be kind of a God. He has reached God level, which is blasphemy to them, speaking out against God, dishonoring him with your words. And that's why they slapped him. And we see Paul's humanity come through in his response. This is not his best moment. He knew what Jesus taught to do in this situation. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 5? He said, I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And that's not what Paul does. He responds in anger instead of turning the other cheek. Right? He verbally attacks the high priest, the most powerful man in the land, and he calls him a whitewashed wall. In other words, he's a hypocrite. There's a dirty wall, and instead of cleaning up the wall, you just paint white over it, and the dirt is still under there. You just can't see it, right? He's a whitewashed wall filled with dirt because he's calling out this unjust slap. Right? You can't apply punishment for blasphemy without a trial and a judgment. This is exactly what Paul did not get. And so Paul is saying, you who are in charge of the law just broke the law. Well, this is really kind of a dangerous moment because Paul is getting distracted from his primary purpose. His attention has moved to Ananias, the high priest, to defending himself, to fighting against this injustice, instead of focusing on Jesus. Instead of telling his story and speaking the truth of Jesus, which was his whole purpose, his opportunity here, he's getting distracted. But as quickly as Paul's humanity is shown in his response, we see Paul refocus himself. He quotes to them not Jesus, turn the other cheek, because they wouldn't have appreciated that. But he quotes to them the law from Exodus 22. Again, saying, as we talked about before, I'm one of you. I understand you. I know how the law works. He says from Exodus 22, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. He steps down in humility. And this really is a Christ-like step of humility by Paul. He knew he was right. He knew he was the victim here, but he chooses not to let his personal desire for justice get in the way of God's purpose for him. It sounds exactly what Jesus did on the cross, right? He chooses not to let his own safety, his own desire for justice get in the way of God's purpose for him. So Paul refocuses. Right? He refuses to stay distracted. And what God does next really makes me smile. Right? Before we read on, let me tell you a bit more about the Sanhedrin. These 71 men mostly come from two different parties or groups. The Pharisees on one hand and the Sadducees on the other. And like most political systems today, there's two parties, like maybe you call them conservatives and the liberals, whatever names they have, but there's two major perspectives, and these parties need to meet in the middle and try and work things out together. And that doesn't always work so well, does it? Well, the same thing happens here. These Pharisees and Sadducees agreed on many things, but they disagreed passionately on many other things. And one of those things that they disagreed about was the religious perspective on resurrection from the dead. Right? The Pharisees believed that at the end of our lives, there's a bodily resurrection, that there's a future heaven, that there is an afterlife for us. The Sadducees, on the other hand, believed there was no resurrection. There is no heaven. There is no angels. There are no spirits. There's no afterlife. And it was a point of disagreement that they argued often and passionately. Well, a resurrection from the dead was exactly what Paul was on trial for, right? For believing in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So listen to what God does. Read the rest of verses 6 through 11. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from the Pharisees. I'm one of you," he says. "I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection from the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." What a moment. Paul mentions the resurrection from the dead, and the Sanhedrin explodes into chaos. Right? Sadducees and Pharisees begin arguing and then fighting with each other. And they totally forget all about their common purpose. Their common purpose was to stop Paul, to stop Jesus. And they forget. In fact, while trying to win this argument about the resurrection from the dead, amazingly it says, some of the Pharisees actually end up defending Paul and wanting to let him go. Exactly the opposite of what they came to do that day. And this argument becomes so violent that the Roman commander pulls Paul out of there. He pulls him back to the safety of the fortress while this Sanhedrin group just keeps on fighting. It makes me wonder how long it was until anyone noticed that Paul was gone. Right? Who was the first to realize how far from their purpose they had strayed? How awkwardly that meeting must have ended, with no solution to their primary purpose and Paul just gone. They get so distracted that they missed what mattered most to them. And we read that night, from the safety of his cell, God speaks to Paul and says, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." You stayed faithful and focused to your calling to Jerusalem. You've brought Jesus here. We've seen it over the last weeks. He brought Jesus to the church. He brought Jesus to the mob. He brought Jesus to the Roman soldiers. He brought Jesus to the Sanhedrin. Now God says, "I have a new destination for you. You're going to bring Jesus to Rome." In the last 5 chapters we're going to look at are Paul's trip to Rome and the opposition and opportunity that he sees along the way. And as he goes, Paul is going to stay focused. He's going to refuse to be distracted from his purpose. Distraction is such a powerful tool that our enemy uses in our lives to pull us away from Jesus. I'm not even thinking about distracting us from doing great and powerful and risky things for God like Paul was doing. I'm thinking about how easy it is for us to get distracted from simply being in love with Jesus, from living our lives in relationship with him, right? From how I get distracted from keeping my relationship with Jesus top priority in my life. Because there can be so much busyness and noise and pressure in my daily life that I have no room left for Jesus. Or maybe there's times that I simply choose to be distracted from what's important, from what really matters, from Jesus. Sometimes I feel like the dog named Doug from the movie Up. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Up. It's a wonderful Pixar movie that you really should see sometime. But in this movie, this dog named Doug, you can hear his voice, and Doug is passionate about things he loves and about the people who care about him. But he is also so easily distracted. So he'll be in the middle of a deep thought, and all of a sudden he'll see a squirrel. And squirrel, off he goes, distracted. He keeps seeing squirrels. He keeps getting distracted. And that's me so often in my relationship with Jesus, right? He's so important. He's what really matters. And yet, squirrel, I get distracted by these other things in life. You know, in those times when I say to myself, I'm so busy, I don't have time for God in my life, what I'm really admitting is that I'm distracted. Because I seem to find the time to scroll through Facebook and Instagram, but I can't find 15 minutes to spend time with God in the Bible or prayer on my own, with my family, with my kids. I can find the time to go exercise, but I can't find the time to go to church or be a part of a small group once a week. I can find time to watch my favorite sports team play or read a good book or play that online game, but I have no time to serve Jesus or learn more about him or just be with him and learn to experience the depth of his grace and love. Those other things in life are some really good things. They are. There's nothing wrong with them. But too often, I let them distract me from Jesus. We let them distract us from Jesus. Now, our spiritual enemy doesn't need to convince us to turn our backs on God. He just needs to distract us with shiny, beautiful things in life that catch our attention, that become our priority, that crowd Jesus out of our lives. Paul, here in this passage, he caught himself being distracted, and he quickly refocused his purpose. Right? And as he lived out his number one purpose, Jesus Christ, he found peace and joy and contentment that comes from trusting Jesus and following his lead no matter the circumstances. Now might be the time for us to catch ourselves in our distractions and to refocus. Now might be a good time to ask ourselves, what is it in my life that's taking priority over Jesus? What's keeping me away from him? What's distracting me from him? Identify that distraction. And then follow up with the question of, how then can I refocus on what really matters? What's a step that I can take to refocus and stop being distracted? Maybe that step is as simple as scheduling a time in your calendar each day with God. Maybe first thing in the morning or last thing, or both first and last, to find a good tool to help you. Right? We just set up a library at Mountainview with some great devotional books for adults and kids. Maybe take one and spend 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes on your lunch break, 15 minutes in the evening, the last thing you do before bed, and think about God and spend time with him. Maybe use your phone. There's a great app that somebody from church shared with us a while ago named Lectio 365, right? And it's simply a few moments first thing in the morning, a few moments last thing at night to help you spend 5 minutes, 5, 15, whatever it is, with God. And it now comes in Spanish as well. Maybe there's another tool that you would like to use. Right? Maybe it's partnering with a friend to be accountable, just to say, yes, I did my devotion today. I spent time with God today. Did you? Maybe it's starting a new routine of Bible reading or prayer with your family or with your kids at dinner time or at bedtime. Maybe it means turning off the radio in your car every once in a while on your commute and using that time to talk to God or listen to God, just to notice Him. Maybe it means committing to growing together in community here at church or in a small group. For some of us, it might mean really exploring faith for yourself, discovering who Jesus really is, what He's done for you, how much He loves you. Reading the Gospel of John is a great place to start. What is a step that you could take to intentionally refocus on Jesus? And know that making room for Jesus doesn't mean we can't enjoy the good things of life. You don't need to quit doing the things you love, right? I'm going to keep on hiking. I'm going to keep reading. I'm going to keep enjoying Detroit Tigers baseball. But I can't let those good things distract me from what's really important. I can't let them crowd out Jesus from my life. Let me end with Paul's message to the Philippians. Right? Paul is looking at all the things in his life that he thought were so important. Those things that he invested his time and energy into, the shiny distractions of life. And he comes to this conclusion. He writes, I consider them garbage that I may gain Christ and be found in Him, forgetting what is behind and straining towards what is ahead. I press on towards the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. Paul realizes only one thing matters, Jesus, and he will not be distracted. How about us?